Shall we start promptly? Why not? There's lots of people, and we're all here, and we want to use the time. So, um, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining this, the latest in our series of conversations. I'm Adrian Ellis. I'm the chair of the Global Cultural Districts Network, and I'm delighted to see so many people and so many names continuing to pop up in the attendee list. This evening's topic is in some ways a fairly obvious one at the 1 year mark of COVID, but it was prompted in part by Andras Santo, who is moderating this session, by a great book that Andras managed to research, write, interview, and get published all under cover of COVID. And it's called The Future of the Museum, 28 Dialogues. And I highly recommend it. But what is very interesting about it is that the dialogues are inevitably about this moment. And they're about all the pressures that are bearing down on the cultural sector. It's about museums, but it applies more generally to the whole range of the cultural sector. And it focuses a lot on the commonalities. And those commonalities, both in sort of diagnosis and prescription, are so striking that I thought it would be interesting to explore some of that territory. And it's on that basis that Andras has put together a fantastic panel of very incisive people, all of whose work in various ways I'm familiar with and thrilled. And so with no more sucking up of air, I'd like to hand across to Andras and to the team, and thank you very much. And I'm very, very much looking forward to this.
Well, thank you, Adrian, and thank you to everybody. I see people are still joining us, and Adrian wasn't idle either during the pandemic. And in fact, one of the things we did together before the book came out was a little joint article in ArtNet magazine, which us visual arts people look at, where we said, well, reopening museums, it should be obvious. And so we decided, let's enumerate the practical steps involved. And I think we were both rather startled and taken aback at just how complicated the task turned out to be. But that was one of the fun projects of last year. And indeed, the other one was this book, which sort of is a product of the pandemic period, although attempted to look past that and think about where the future of the museum, and I should say the future of the cultural institution, may lie. And when the book started, it was in a way an exercise of like, let's talk to everybody and see what happens. Not so much a demonstration of a thesis, but what was rather interesting, as Adrian has alluded, is that there was a striking degree of alignment in the responses. Indeed, Charles Suarez Smith, the former director of the National Gallery, has labeled this a new orthodoxy. I wouldn't quite go that far, least of all because nobody's imposing it. But there was an interesting set of parallels in the responses. You know, we were speaking in June and July to these museum directors. Many of their museums closed. And I like to call this the sort of three pivots, which everybody seemed to be making at the time. The pivot to digital, which I have to say was rather striking and sudden and extraordinary. The pivot to the local audience, there being very little foreseeable regional, national, and international audience. And of course, a pivot in recognition to the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in this country, the killing of George Floyd and the ensuing really worldwide reckoning with systemic economic and racial injustice and the position that cultural institutions had in that context, which may turn out to be one of the more lasting parts of this. But today, and it's sort of stunning to consider that we're really a year into these lockdowns now, and indeed they're still continuing, something I wouldn't have imagined while I was working on this book. It is a good time to ask, what are institutions learning from this experience? What are cities and cultural districts, for that matter, learning from this experience? What is it that we know today that we didn't know a year ago? How are we wiser? And more importantly, what are the real actionable ideas and new models that can come out of this? This is a really harsh time, and nobody wants to turn it into some happy case of silver linings, but new things are coming out of it. I like to compare the COVID experience to a heart attack. You know, even before you get a heart attack, you know that you're supposed to be exercising more and eating better. But it's only when you get that wake-up call that you end up having the real behavior modification. But what is that behavior modification? Well, whatever it is, and hopefully we'll learn today, we know that it's really tough. Changing institutions, changing policies, changing cultural arenas is really difficult. And I guess the question today might be for the panel, how do we go from talking about doing the right things to actually doing them? Luckily, we have three extraordinary people from both sides of the Atlantic and from both the visual and the performing arts and sort of from the arts policy sector. Diane Drubet is originally from France, although now sitting in Berlin, where she guides museums through changes as a museum strategy consultant, and also very importantly, the convener of a network of more than 1,000 people working to change museums called We Are Museums. Stephanie Fortunato is just up the street from me, a couple of 100 miles away in Providence, north of New York City. She's director of the Department of Art and Culture and Tourism there, so therefore charged with planning and reconfiguring cultural facilities and the city's sort of public spaces for cultural uses. And then Marcus Davey from the United Kingdom, chief executive of the Roundhouse, which he describes as the largest creative center in Europe, particularly with a large youth audience that he's really transforming into what I would consider a kind of case study of an audience-centric institution with a particularly interesting market emphasis on youth governance. Before we launch it, I just want to say, I think it's great that the Cultural Districts Group is taking up this topic and these issues. Why? Because institutions are not going to solve these issues alone. The challenges that we're talking about are systemic. The responses are ultimately collaborative. They involve policies, collective resources, rhetoric developed collectively. And while some of the issues are perhaps abstract, the actions are very, very practical, even mundane in some cases. So a very appropriate topic with the group. So we're going to sort of launch in. I'm going to ask each person a little bit about where they're coming from on this topic, and then hopefully we'll turn it into more and more of a dialogue or a trialogue or a quadrilogue or whatever the right word is. And then along the way, there's a little Q&A box. We welcome your thoughts and questions, and I'll try to incorporate those so far as my Zooming skills permit me to do so. So Stephanie, we're going to start with you. You really work at the intersection of urban development and cultural development. So tell me what actions you and your colleagues are working on in response to this experience. You know, what has really coalesced for you as the most important conclusions and priorities of this moment?
Thanks, Andras. Yeah, I have to say the framing for this panel, I so appreciate, and I appreciate the moment to really do a deep reflection on what we have learned over this past year, because it has been quite an extraordinary journey, I think, from those first moments to where we sit now. And the homogeneity of these responses, I mean, in some ways, like you say with the heart attack example, which I just love, you know, we've really needed for a long time to be looking at these structural issues with more seriousness and rigor. And yet it seems like now, a year in, this is where the real work is beginning. So for my team, you know, that has meant really thinking about our public space management and our policies really quickly, adopting innovative practices and then putting them into play with community at a scale and a pace in which we haven't before. Thinking about hospitality, arts, tourism industries and the impacts that really have shaken these sectors, and the ways in which we can help to address that. And then, of course, thinking about social justice reform, thinking about, how do we advance the work of racial justice in the city of Providence? And there's a whole portfolio of projects that really have been spearheaded in part with our cultural and creative communities in Providence around truth-telling, reconciliation, and reparations, but that are really addressing those big structural issues. And yet, as I say, now is when the work is really beginning. And even though this laundry list is so critically important, it doesn't even come close to being comprehensive in terms of the things that we need to do on the ground to really be able to take this moment and pivot for a new better, as one colleague is calling it. And so, I think here, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the past year are the number of people in my community who are facing food insecurities. I don't think that was visible to me a year ago. And it's something that now I can't unsee. I think it's something that's critically important. The way that this pandemic has also impacted the historically marginalized communities so disproportionately, really truly is shocking. It's maybe something that we knew but couldn't see, but now we need to do everything that we have in our influence to be able to address that. And then there's something, that I want to raise attention to that I think certainly is near and dear to my heart, but I want to say that another thing that I'm seeing is that mothers are in crisis. Right? So this pandemic has been framed as a she-cession. We have seen women leaving the workplace by their own choice and or because the sectors where they're employed and are just been hit hard. And so unemployment, underemployment, we're seeing that throughout the creative sector. We're seeing that, sort of disproportionately in the healthcare industries. But we're seeing that at every level, at executive women, to the service industry and the whole pandemic. And I think what I see is that there's an unevenness in the responsibilities for caring for families, particularly in opposite sex couples. But this is something that my network is talking about constantly. And I think it's really important that we keep this in mind because it's a conversation that goes beyond, should the schools be open? The logistical challenges of dealing with a hybrid school schedule on the fly. It goes well beyond that because we're talking about a wage gap that has stayed pretty constant for decades, and that's really not okay. So I guess the call to action for all of us is that we really need to think about women, about mothers in the way that we design our cities, which up until this point have largely been designed by and for men. We need to think about this with our communities. So the shift to the local, how much are we talking about women's issues as we're designing programs and reframing policies? Are we checking in with our colleagues at work and making not only just caregiver accommodations, but really checking in to see how people are doing emotionally as well as financially and all the rest? And are we checking in with our family and friends? It really comes to home at the end of the day. And I think that these are sort of calls to action that are just being picked up by the media. The New York Times has recently done a story on the primal scream. And so we'll get into some of maybe potential programmatic incentives later on.
Yeah. Let me just, before we move on, because I want to keep us to the brief of providing actionable ideas. So that you've laid out a marvelous buffet of challenges. But when it comes to this last one, is there a particular program in relation to women as regards cultural facilities and cultural actors that you can name that actually responds to the challenge you've identified?
I think that there are probably great examples of individual programs, but I think, Andres, it's also thinking about cultural institutions as places that are welcoming to women, to families, and creating programs that not only offer sort of a contemplation that you might find in an art museum, or an intellectual stimulation, but maybe even childcare. You go to the gym, you can drop off your kid for 2 hours. I mean, back in the day when we used to go to the gym. But when was the last time you saw that kind of program at a museum, for instance? So I think
somewhere in Scandinavia, but we will come back to physical facilities, because that's really a huge part of this, the retrofitting of facilities. But I want to move on now to Marcus, who started out as a pot maker and a musician. You went on to run festivals and summer schools, and now you're charged with this organization, which is particularly has a very large youth audience. So I'd like to hear what have been your big takeaways, and similarly, perhaps an example of an actionable, specific project or something you put in motion to respond to it.
Thanks very much, Andras. And Stephanie, it's great to follow you. And you covered quite a lot of the territory already. So it leaves me just to talk about the kind of impact stuff as well. But just a thing about the Roundhouse, for those people who are listening, and I just looked down the participants list, and there's lots of people I know. So hello to you. Those who don't know, the Roundhouse is actually a creative centre for young people, where we work with 7,500 young people in the year before COVID struck, 60% from areas of multiple deprivation, and 50% of them were Black or Asian or from other ethnic minorities. You may think of the Roundhouse as being the big performance space in North London, which it is, where the likes of international artists Jay-Z and Lady Gaga perform, but it's also a beautiful historical building. Society and democracy are very fragile. That's, I think, the thing that we can really reflect on. These things that we took maybe are taken for granted. Those who are privileged to live in countries where that is something that we can take for granted, and it has suddenly been eroded. COVID has exposed the inequities and inequalities, and you just think in Britain that 60% of the over 130,000 people who have died have had a disability. We know that the cultural inequity of the cultural divide of digital means that those people who are suddenly able to watch so much content for free from theatres and galleries and music halls, whatever, during this time, it's changing. And that's now going to a paid for platform. So we haven't learned that one. And as humans, we have a great ability not to learn. We love to talk about doing things, but actually we don't learn. So what can we actually do? So I wanted to just focus on a couple of things about how we can share power. So at the Roundhouse, we have 2 young trustees under the age of 25. We're going to have a further focus on how we share power with young people. I think if you have young people actively involved as participants and not recipients, you will know many of the inequalities that happen in life, especially if you're working with those that are the most excluded in our society. You'll know that there's racial inequality. You'll know that some of them are living from food banks. You'll know that some of them are homeless. And those things are very vivid when you actively involve young people in the core of your organization, and making sure that you reach out into society and find those young people that otherwise wouldn't be represented, and to have a voice on the tables of power. And we are all powerful leaders in our societies, whether we think we are or not. So that's one thing. Personally, I want to be a better ally and understand the privileges that I have better, and to make sure that I am not just reenacting all the stuff that was happening before COVID hit and before the Black Lives Matter movement really came into our lives with such importance and urgency. We have published our anti-racism commitments 7 months ago, and we've done a 6-month update. That's change, and it is changing the organisation in which we work. And then a smaller one, but a really important one. I think many of us probably found that we were living a Zoom life. Well, we're living it right now. In these kind of events, we would have probably popped to the bar and had a chat with somebody we didn't know. Wasn't that brilliant? Now we can't. We're going to go off and do the washing or whatever we're going to do. I was finding that I was very lucky to be sitting at the table with other chief executives, 30 of them, you know, of the major arts institutions in our country. I was feeling more and more uncomfortable that the voice of other people we weren't sharing as a group. So I reached out to some of those organizations that I really respected who weren't at that table and set up a community venues group, which I have learned so much from, much more diverse in terms of race and age and gender. And together we are forming a partnership to reach out to those young Londoners that haven't had a voice at the table, with a project to listen to young people first, and then to put those suggestions that they have into action. My deepest concern through all of this is that I suspect COVID is a sideshow for what is going to come with climate change. And unless we can pull together as societies and really think about some kind of leveling of the playing field, the next stage in our human existence is going to be much more difficult. This is a warning shot that we can do something so much better than what we have done before. So in some ways, COVID has given us a really deadly blow to so many people, but maybe it's the warning we needed.
Before we move on, and thank you for expressing those thoughts so poetically even, and I know Diane will be coming back to the issue of the environment, and I want us to come back at longer length. But before we go there, what have you put in place to ensure that these very meaningful actions are not just designed for this moment? You know, we all make New Year's resolutions and so on, but how does it stick? How do these changes stick?
Okay, so some of those we've been very lucky. We've had young people on the board of trustees for 15 years. They have a year's term, and we have a youth advisory board, and we work with many thousands of young people each year based on our work with young people. So that bit is part of who we are, but what more can we do? How more can we listen? How can we champion? And so we're building a new building. We've been raising money throughout, and we've got planning permission. We're going to start that. And that's going to be a centre for creative entrepreneurs aged 18 to 30, and 5 extra, big studios, so we can extend our numbers and reach to even more young people. In terms of our anti-racism commitments, we're doing training throughout the whole organisation, changing our recruitment practices, and rewriting the rules in which we engage. So we set up a Black Workers Forum and a whole range of other commitments, which you can just look at online. They're there for everybody to see and for everyone to comment on. I think the thing that we felt was, if we weren't public, then we could be doing anything. So let's hold ourselves up to our staff, to our public, to our donors, to our supporters. Only yesterday, we're having part of our race equity training. And just a small example. Okay, how do you deal with that moment when you're doing a fundraising dinner and one of your donors, rich, probably white male, is sitting next to one of your young people who may not be white, maybe a person of colour, and the donor says, "So where are you from?" And they say, "North London." They say, "No, where are you really from?" "Well, North London." "No, where do you come from?" How do you deal with a situation like that? And so these are really practical, small things that actually build a bigger picture where everyone can start feeling that they have a voice to share in power.
Great. Well, I suspect, Diane, these are some of the issues you're also talking with your museums that you advise. You have been working with institutions to guide them through changes, and that has involved digital transformation, community-oriented transformation, environmental transformation, and you make all these into events as well. And I realized that our 2 previous speakers have sort of already claimed some very interesting territories in this conversation, but I'm very curious what in particular is top of mind for you? And I guess you're sort of our designated museum person as well. So tell us.
Thank you, Andras, and thank you, Adrienne, for inviting me today. It was exactly like Stephanie said. It was actually very good to be able to prepare this panel discussion and to finally take the time to reflect. I feel so a lot of similar things, obviously, because we live this globally. But I feel that unfortunately, museums really have learned what is a trauma. And this is something really new for most of us, for most of museums and museum workers. They have been experiencing stress, anxiety, and even depression, losing faith, losing vision, losing hope. It was personally and for all our community very, very tough to go through all these roller coaster, emotional roller coaster. And I think despite everything else, this is a lesson of life and a lesson of an emotional lesson that we have been learning. Of course, we learned as well to share, to be able to stay benevolent, to celebrate togetherness and to bounce back. So we try to set up different kind of settings and platforms so museum can learn from each other, can stay very supportive, and can learn about resilience and such and different kind of soft skills that they really need if they want to change within themselves and become these agents of change that we need. We had, like, I can give so many different examples. For instance, at one of our online meetup, we had the director of the Women's Museum in Aarhus in Denmark, called Julie Rogerbirch. She explained that her team started to collect different kind of stories of people, but not any kind of stories. For instance, they started to collect stories of women experiencing domestic violence and so many others. The team actually went outside of the museum. They opened, they went in malls, they went in public garden, in private gardens as well. I feel that even if the field started to lose face and trying to find how to deal with this trauma, beautiful creativity, imagination, and new ways to actually activate local communities have been imagined. I heard that the Gender Museum in Ukraine has done exactly the same. And I know that many museums have done the same, like collecting this kind of stories and going outside of their normal little box. What I feel was the hardest is to see that the system totally pushed museums away for 1 year, and it was quite easy. It was actually not easy for museums and museum workers to leave the place and understand that the situation was the way it was. But it was easy to close the door from one day to another because we asked them to do it. They did it. And we also saw in 2 weeks so many museums being criticized by their structural and ethical infrastructure, the governance. So I feel that a lot of fragilities have been revealed as well. And this was fast and unfortunately quite easy. Again, it was just like everything was ready to be revealed. And I feel that even if for the past 10 years, I've seen amazing museums, more than hundreds museums, really changing and becoming these agents of change, the museum field itself as a system is not ready yet to become this crucial heartbeat, this crucial lever that we need to go into the next step. And if you start to look at nature, for instance, if you want to really understand how an ecosystem is working and how biodiversity is working, it's actually all about the capacity to adapt to changing conditions and staying locally attuned. And this is something that museums started to learn as well during this pandemic. This example with the Women's Museum in Aarhus really showed that museums, they know how to adapt to changing conditions and to stay locally attuned. But this cannot be done alone. Again, in nature, it's all about cooperation, mutual benefits, symbiosis. That's really key in nature. And to make it fast, what I really learned and what the community of We Are Museums really learned is actually the power and the potential of the collective. And we start to believe in the collective intelligence and how together, by taking the time, by sharing the same purpose, and we can actually start to evolve. So yeah, just to make it fast.
Well, you mentioned also when we were preparing for this conversation that, you know, of the 1,300 people in your network, the unifying features, they all want to change things. So my question to you before we move on is, what is the single biggest inhibitor of change? I mean, specifically in the institutions you talk to, where is the pushback? What is the biggest obstacle to that change?
Obstacle to change, I think it's loneliness. If you actually, most of the time change happens with one step, one individual, one single individual willing to do something and pushing. At one point, energy is going, and because time is actually heavy on one's back. If you start to gather more people, even if it's more people from other museums, if you start to see that you're not alone in this fight, talking about so many different fights, we talked about the climate, we can talk about ethics, we can talk about so many different fights. We need to feel that we are together. And at one point, all these coalitions, communities, cooperative, collective actions are actually having an effect. And it's what we see when we actually, we have been talking to a lot of museums starting their climate journey. It always starts with one person, but then if we want this person to actually create a movement of change within the museum, it has to grow with some few colleagues, and then it has to go in different steps, in different levels of the organization. So I feel like it's really my personal impression, but loneliness and is actually the biggest obstacle to change.
Well, a number of big themes have already, in fact, you know, we could spend probably a couple of days just on the pieces that have already been put on the table. But just for starters, we've heard about sort of the prior invisibility of certain problems and certain social groups in terms of what was on the radar. We've talked about the fragility of the entire social fabric, the institutional system, the fragility of democracy. I think in different ways, you have each alluded to the sort of lack of fit between the existing institutions and the kinds of problems that, or the circumstances that in which they're operating, or the issues they're trying to adapt. And even the sort of lack of protocols and blueprints for adaptation in certain areas. And of course, the unifying theme, just as Diana was just describing, was change. And, you know, all three of you are change makers and change enablers. And we have in the audience, it looks like 80 people who are probably consider themselves change agents. And as a practical matter, I want to make this our first little topic to come back to, which is engineering behavioral change. You know, cultural institutions tend to have a way of creating cyclical, you know, the season, okay, the next season, they sort of keep doing the same thing a little bit. So if there is this desire for change in the institutions or in institutional systems, like in a city like yours, Stephanie, where's the thread you pull? Where do you start? Where's your leverage?
One of the things that we have been implementing about past 18 months or so is inviting artists to be in residence in city departments and community-based organizations. I'm sure everybody who is attending this webinar works with artists and knows one of the things that artists do best is kind of pushing the edges, right? If there is a border, if there is a boundary, they're gonna test where that is. And so we've had some success actually embedding artists in different departments and have them help us see where the policies need to shift and change. Marcus, I think, you know, this gets to your idea of sharing power. Many people don't know how to navigate city government, for instance, but there are creative staff members in every single area of the city. And real change happens when you can find those people and activate them. So I think that, you know, artist residencies is one way in which we can think about really helping to seed catalytic change that extends beyond the sector. You know, we're really then enlisting partners and forming alliances with culture, with arts at the heart, which for me that's the thing that's going to help us not only in this cultural shift, but Diane, what you said about the loneliness, right? That just like hit me because it's so true, I think, but it's really sad also. And so I think if we learn nothing else, it's that we have to take care of each other. And so I do believe that artists have a role to play in helping us to get to that place where we can actually really
okay,
do
so
that.
Diane is saying the individual actor in the organization that sort of gets the ball rolling. Stephanie is saying, let's embed the artists as sort of disruptors. Marcus, where's your leverage? I mean, you've talked about governance. Are there other ways to sort of push the ball?
Yeah, I think so. And it comes down two things maybe I'll reflect on. One, I love what you're just saying there, Stephanie. Absolutely, artists involved. Just going back over history, many of the cultural changes have happened with young artists, from psychedelia to punk to, you know, you can name them and you could list them on your hand, Amanda Gorman and, you know, many others. I think there's something about, if we went down into the basics of this, there's, you know, we want to make change. How are we going to do that? Something about recruitment of new staff coming in. How are you going to recruit new staff? It's a question because we're not going to do the same way, are we? So what are we going to do that's different? Are we going to open it up for people who are passionate about it, but may not have all the skills and the experience? So actually, let's dispense with the written application and the CV. Let's have job fairs. Let's have workshops. And, you know, there's lots of proof that a lot of that brings a great wealth of diversity into organizations. So within a 3-year time frame, you know, we all have turnover, churn in our staff. You can actually completely change something in 3 years. That's not enough though. I think it has to come from the top. And by setting, if we're talking about gender, or if we're talking about diversity of ethnic diversity, then we set targets at our board level. So gender parity, representation of people of color, and we've set our target of 40%. Being in London, that's about what would be about right. And do it within a time frame. And again, publish those commitments so that everybody knows what you're doing. One of the things I started doing at the very beginning of the first lockdown, nearly a year ago, was doing, because everyone was all over the place. You know, over 2 days, we've gone from working in an office to working at home. I'd never spent a day in my whole working life working at home. I'd always worked in an office. And it could have freaked me out, but luckily it didn't, because I knew I had an organization to be responsible for as well. I started writing a daily news update at the end of every day because there's so many news announcements. Now that's every week. But through focusing on what I have been doing during the week and what the leadership team have been doing, I've been able to communicate better with the whole organization. So the whole organization has felt together as we move forward. These are simple little changes, but I wasn't doing it before. But that's something I've learned and done better going forward. And I'm going to keep doing it.
So these are like inside institution changes, but I want to pivot now to the macro side of this. One of the things that's really striking and was striking to me both in my book and now in your responses is that you're talking as heads or advisors to, you know, at the end of the day, quite small organizations. Even the largest cultural groups are ultimately quite small in terms of their resources, right? Their balance sheet and so on. And yet, we are talking about tackling enormous structural social problems, inequality, racism, environmental catastrophe, you name it. So clearly these are not issues that a cultural institution or even all cultural institutions together can alone move the needle on. You need to come outside of your wheelhouse, as it were. And in my book, Hans-Ulrich Obrist talks about how the Serpentine is trying to work on climate change and has assembled a kind of global network of influencers all the way to Jane Fonda to do this. So I'm curious, first of all, is it hubristic of our field to tackle these issues? I mean, are we able to? And that's a rhetorical question. I think I know your answer. But if we're going to do it, what are the alliances to build? You know, how do we have to get outside of the routine operations to really impact these gigantic systemic issues? Diane.
This is actually all I've been thinking about for the past year on an individual level for We Are Museums, going through what we were doing before to what we can become next, because definitely what we were doing was mostly about empowering museum professionals at a very individual level. And then when we saw that the system was really pushing away museums so easily, we saw that we should start to change things in the systemic level and thinking about the museum as an ecosystem. And then definitely when you start to think about an ecosystem, it's what I said just before, you need to think about cooperation, you need to think about mutual benefit, you need to think about collective, and this sense of togetherness and purpose is really what is missing in the red thread or this web is actually missing, I feel. That's why the importance of such network as the one we are in today is crucial. We need more and more networks like that, networks of purpose and not only networks of practices. And this is really something that we have seen so many networks and so many communities sharing this kind of top-down approach. Okay, I've done something right, I will show you how it's working. And it's what we have done in conferences a lot. This cannot work anymore. We need to really use the potential of collective intelligence to co-create, co-think different solutions and solve different kind of challenges, because this is very, very complex. Like you said, it's huge. and one individual, one museum, one network cannot actually tackle this kind of very complex issues. So for me, it's all about co-owning, co-leading, cooperating, and it's all about the collective. And I hope, finally, we will start seeing that this kind of big change can actually happen if we really join forces and not compete anymore. This cannot work anymore.
Stephanie, you're operating, of course, at the city government level. And you've got some major universities in your backyard, industry. How are you thinking about this kind of joining of forces?
Specifically, of late, we've been thinking a lot about the recovery plans and proposals. And something that I've been saying all along is that it cannot just be about our economic recovery. It has to be about our social, our cultural, our environmental recovery as well. So I think that thinking about coalitions beyond the sector is critical, because otherwise, the well-being of our community is sort of balanced on these different fields, right? We live in a capitalist environment, so we need to think about economics. But I think what we've seen over the past year is that arts and culture have a critically important place in people's lives. Our creatives may be under and unemployed at the moment, but they're making art that is rallying people together, right? And so I think we need to think about that as we think about our downtown revitalization, as we think about what a feminist recovery plan might look like, as we start to put in practice the principles of anti-racism that we now know must be the foundation for any strong plan to really take root.
I want to change, thank you. Shifting gears a little bit because we have limited time to the physical. So we got these meta big social issues, but then we have cities and public spaces and facilities, brick and mortar. And this morning I woke up here in New York, the New York Times had an article, or I don't know, somebody had an article about how one of the department stores in Oxford Street in London is being transformed into an art center because the department store is no more. And then IKEA, somewhere also in England, that's becoming an art center. I'm curious how you all are thinking about this repurposing. First of all, is our old infrastructure the right infrastructure? And secondly, what specifically where you sit in your life do you see as opportunities for cultural groups or cultural networks to address these needs, both in terms of how the public space should change, or where we may, what empty spaces we may fill? Maybe Marcus.
I was hoping you were going to ask me the last question, but anyway, that's fine. I love what both my colleagues on the panel were talking about in that, about collaboration.
But feel free to say more about collaboration also.
We know that COVID has accelerated online shopping. We're all stuck at home and, you need something, you order it and it arrives in a cardboard box the next day. That means that the high street, and it has been happening, it's been going downhill for a long time, needs to be reinvented. Now, there are reinventions all the time. People like to come together though, don't they? We're missing that. One of you talked about loneliness as being one of the worst things that's happened. People love to come together. Our role, I think, has to be that we make sure that all people can come together and we don't lose track of what we've learned through COVID. There's an art centre in Coventry going to be in the IKEA. Fantastic. But on each high street, wouldn't it be great if shop units were creative centres where young people could come and use them, practice rooms, music making, art galleries, places they can share. There's so few places for young people, or actually artists who are professional, emerged artists, to have space to create. If we can have live spaces to, and what we know is, and this is throughout history, so when artists move into an area, it's usually a cheap and run down area. It's not long before the developers follow. However, what we'd love to see, as I think, in Berlin, fantastic work has been done in this area, to have, these shop units, these buildings, most city streets, you see the shops on the ground level, everything's empty above. Why aren't they all turned into artist studios? We partner with a regional city. The Roundhouse partners with Gloucester City Council. And just over a kind of 5 or 6, 7 year period, they've done amazing work at reinventing themselves culturally and looking at spaces that were empty and turning them into music studios or squares which were redundant into performance spaces. I'll come back to one of the colleagues here said, bring artists in, bring artists, make artists the normality, the normal existence for artists to be, and places for young people, and cities will be transformed. I don't know about building new art centres in new buildings. I love this idea of converting other ones. The Roundhouse, of course, was built in 1846 with a steam engine maintenance shed, and it takes your breath away. Snape, in the Snape Maltings building, it's one of the most beautiful concert halls in the world. And I go down to Devon in Dartington, where the Great Hall there, it's an old 14th century banqueting hall, but to see a piece of chamber music or something intimate, there's no better place in the world. There's so many buildings that are going to be empty after this because we'll learn to work in a different way. we're not all going to go back 5 days a week into the office. We might do 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, 2 days with the family. If that happens, we're going to have loads of space available. So let's make them creative spaces. Let's make them available and allocate budget to make sure that young people and artists have more space, and we will see a regeneration of our cities. No doubt about it.
Okay, thank you. I mean, sounds great to me. Certainly here in New York City, we desperately need that in Manhattan in particular. Interestingly enough, Brooklyn hasn't suffered as much in this regard. One of the questions that came in was related to a point that one of you made in passing around food insecurity and food-related solutions, addressing food insecurity. Are there any other specific examples of programs any of you could name in this area to tackle food insecurity?
At the beginning of lockdown, there was a brilliant organisation in Yorkshire, which is an arts organisation that turned itself into a food distribution centre. Now, there are lots of examples of this happening all around the world. I think the difference is that they were fast on it, absolutely did it, but they did it as a performance as well. And they included their art, and it became art and food. And the local council now subcontracted them. And this is a completely different way of thinking about what values an arts organisation can bring to a local community in a different way. The climate crisis is going to mean more food insecurity. We know that mothers, children, parents, families are, 10 million people in Britain, which is a small country, are suffering from food insecurity. That's 1/6 of the population. How can that be in the 21st century? How can it be? It just can't be. And we think, well, that's somebody else's problem, but maybe it isn't. Maybe that's another question we should be thinking about is, what are we doing that actually can change that as well? Because we all know that if a child goes to school and doesn't have food inside them, then they're not going to learn. That means they're discriminated against from the very beginning. The other thing I just wanted to touch on very quickly is this government that we have in Britain at the moment was going to reduce, there was going to be a tailing off of school meals during the holidays during this crisis. And it took a footballer, a celebrity, to fight the government. Why are we living in a culture where taking celebrities to fight governments on things that we think are really important? And maybe this is partly down to the fact that we've had an eroding of society, an eroding of democracy, whereby politicians are thought of less and less and less, and experts are thought less and less and less. We should be championing experts and really supporting the fact that we have democracy and experts should have a view and they should be listened to in it. I'm not saying we shouldn't challenge government. We should challenge government even more. That's what I'm saying.
Well, we have limited time, but we've raised a couple of immense issues here. And the two biggest ones I think we can all agree on is how the sector adapts in the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter situation, which is an enormous set of issues. Certainly here in the United States is probably the most complex and wide-ranging. And then, of course, looking forward, as all of you have mentioned, the climate crisis. We cannot tackle this even if we had 3 days. But I want to ask a question that I thought was very helpful to me in doing these conversations for this book. What is it that cultural institutions need to unlearn in order to address these issues? And you can choose whichever area you want, but what needs to be unlearned from the standard ways of behaving in order to truly adapt in either one of these areas? Stephanie?
I'm like scanning through a multiplicity of answers to this. I mean, at the very basic level, I guess it's making sure that there are BIPOC community members in every room. That's something that I think we have certainly seen in the city of Providence, making sure too that those BIPOC leaders have the support that they need to succeed. So it's not enough just to invite people to the table, but I think that we need to make sure that there are resources there, both to provide technical assistance and support so that their artistic vision, for instance, can be achieved, but that there is a real impact of the work in different areas.
Diane?
Well,
I know it's a long list, but I want to hear the most important thing.
Well,
I know it's a very long list.
Yeah, what is just coming into my head right away is expertise and this. I feel that museum institutions in the old institutions, the old structures are actually a compact group of egos, not really celebrating plurality and soft skills, but celebrating certain kind of rank in the society and experts and diplomats. I feel that if we want to imagine regenerative futures, we need to have more soft skills, and we need to have more diverse teams. And these very rigid structures, making a museum totally not agile, can't exist anymore. We need to be able to support people to listen deeper and longer, to really celebrate this sense of togetherness and purpose, and just celebrate change and seeing that change is actually the only constant in life, and this permanent, this durability permanent state of what is a museum should be unlearned, to my mind. I don't know if it was very clear, but
no, absolutely. And we hear these voices from the field. I'm curious, not to put you on the spot, but what is an institution that comes to mind? Who's getting this right? Is there any particular city or institution or place where you see this happening?
Yeah, like so much actually. I can like museums doing it right, you said, huh? Because I don't want to point anyone, but anyone doing bad. Like I was mentioning the Women's Museum in Aarhus. We talked with Julie Decker from the Anchorage Museum in Alaska, and so many of them, like every week actually, we welcome museums and museum directors, museum practitioners, really celebrating this kind of skills and this kind of diversity and plurality, and this purpose. So like more and more, actually, that's why having and living and going through this trauma was even harder, because I feel that we were cut in such beautiful movement of change. And it is now that we need to support each other even more and to really celebrate this togetherness and this collective even more. And Stephanie, you talked about coalitions going beyond the sector, and I totally believe in that as well. It's time to join.
Marcus, I know you've been working on this, but what is it in the end that needs to be unlearned? What are the reflexes that need to be retrained to really tackle these immense adaptations?
Well, I think Stephanie and Diane said some incredible things there about coming together, listening. Listening, I think, is a really important thing, but structured listening. So that actually there's a way that you can listen within and outside your organization. It's not just a word that we use, but it's something that we structure into place. So we're working on some methods for that. But I come back to sharing power. I come back to young people again. It's something that's the closest thing to my heart, which is we wrote a guide to youth governance a number of years ago. And that's available on our website for anybody who wants it, called Guided by Young Voices. And that has been sent out to thousands of organizations and downloaded, and has had a major impact on lots of organizations. I hear stories all the time from organizations saying they become more relevant because they've got young people involved. And the conversation, the thing that I think is most important is at our board meetings, before we have to do them on Zoom, the two young trustees sat opposite the chair and me, the chief executive. So whenever we're talking about major decisions, it always involves young people. There are very subtle things that you can do that make a very big impact. So everything we do includes young people. We're not talking about young people, we're planning with young people. And I think that's a philosophy that we're all talking about, is doing things with people rather than doing them for people. And I think society has moved on where, yeah, of course, there are some people that just want a good service. You know, they want a good road or a train ticket and that stuff like that. But there are a lot more people in the kind of work that we do where they want to participate. And if we don't open up participation, then, you know, we're missing out on a reservoir, a huge reservoir of creativity and potential in our society.
I mean, what strikes me about all of your responses is that I think what I'm hearing from all of you are actual change in long-term habits. And I know earlier I used the perhaps uncouth analogy of the heart attack, but in this case too, I think what you're all saying is that, you know, binge dieting is not the solution. You know, small adaptation in long-term is the solution. And, you know, once you actually alter those mechanisms of power, put different people around the table, then you have an ongoing solution. The temptation often, though, is, you know, we put up the new diversity guidelines or we sign on to something and we make a big splash out of making an announcement that we have, you know, done the right thing. But then these more fundamental, deeper realignments in the decision-making are perhaps not happening. So that's a very interesting idea with the young people. Reminds me of the Bonnefanten Museum in Holland, which established an office called YO, the Young Office, because they came to the conclusion that middle-aged people really have no idea how to program for young people. So they created an office for young people under 25 and gave them a budget. And lo and behold, they decided to do different things than you know, credentialed middle-aged people would have done. About the climate crisis, this is really, I mean, I'm not sure if we're ready to have a big conversation about the climate crisis, having just come out of this one or beginning to come out of this one. But it's clear, all of you have said, this is the next big thing. But it strikes me that some of the conversation around it is, I'm not sure if it's really about the real solution. So for example, in the museum field, everybody's talking about no more traveling shows. You know, but the real pollution is buildings and, you know, so when it really comes to reducing carbon footprint and modifying behavior and altering mindsets, what do you think are the most important ways the cultural sector can contribute to this problem, both as an energy consumer and both as a mentality modifier?
I'll just say that the City of Providence has a climate justice plan, and our sustainability office worked on that with community members. There's actually a group called the Racial Environmental Justice Committee that helped to advise and create that. And that's a community-based group that really set very specific targets and benchmarks for our municipality. And it is all things. It is building emissions. It is the tree canopy. It is the social determinants of health in neighborhoods where asthma rates are extraordinarily high. And so one of the things about the climate crisis for me, and I always say this to the director of sustainability, she says the most shocking things, like it's so big, it's almost hard to take in the seriousness of the situation. But the sustainability office has done a great job of really creating very very achievable plans. And I think that there's something in that actually we can all learn from. We're currently doing cultural planning and thinking about the places where the climate justice plan intersects with the cultural sector, and really thinking about those lessons. And we have an artist in residence working with our sustainability office, thinking about community resiliency hubs. So, you know, that's another way in which we've been able to address this a bit.
And what happens when the artist in residence, I don't know, writes up a report about community resiliency hubs? Like, what is the feedback loop? Does it sort of stay in the drawer, or is it going to actually have a hearing among the powers that be?
They are actually building a seed library that will be in an archive at one of our community libraries. So in that way, they're sort of building the capacity for the community library to be the center for these conversations to continue. But it is a first attempt, so I'll keep you guys posted on how it goes.
Marcus and Diane again. So how do we move the needle as a sector, both as contributors to the the environmental sustainability issue, but also as teachers, as public opinion shapers?
Well, if I may, I really like actually the really short comment of Anna in the chat. She just talked about digital sobriety, and of course, digital is also really, really huge. Building are huge, but what I wanted to say is that if you want to keep seeing change happening, you need to empower people, and you need to give them the chance to actually act and do something. Talking about the big things is not empowering people, is actually blocking them and freezing them. I like to think that the climate change can be actually tackled at different levels. You have the digital one, you have the building, waste and energy, you have the community level, you can raise awareness, you can become more a climate activist, you can also join a global coalition for climate justice, like in Canada, or other network already doing a huge job to change governance and museum policies. It is good really important to understand that you can act at different levels and never always care for the people and what they can do, and never try to actually say that what you're doing is wrong, because this is not empowering at all. It is not caring for what the person can do. It is just forcing someone to not move anymore. And we've seen that a lot for the past 10 years, showing that as you can't do it, or you do it wrong, people are not moving anymore. They just lose motivation. You don't want that at all. So it's really important to show so many different levels, so many different ways to start your climate journey. And then step by step, we will tackle the building, we will tackle the big things. But at least you need to keep these people motivated.
Now, I noticed that I've only received a couple of questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that nobody's sitting there without one. There's a little box there to add in your questions in the Q&A. And if there is anybody, I do want to make sure that we don't lose the opportunity to respond to you. So please raise your hand or type in the question. Marcus, did you have any thoughts on this last issue in the meantime?
I mean, the least impact we've made is in the last year because we've been closed. So we could just stay closed. That'll probably do the best thing. But of course, we're not going to do that because actually people want to come together. And I love that thing about working on different levels. This is really challenging, isn't it? Because not only is it this huge crisis that we know is here, it's not coming, it's here. But when there are millions and millions of people wondering where their food is going to come from or where the roof over their head is going to be, it's not going to be the priority. Talking to young people at the Roundhouse, many of them feel that, yeah, it's a really important thing, but where are they going to be sleeping next week? Those are the immediate issues. So what are we doing? So probably 6 years ago, we set up, 5 or 6 years ago, we set up a diversity and inclusion working group that has had a real impact on the organisation. And particularly an event we call Driving Change, which is an event like this, but it's coming up on the 23rd of March, which everyone's be very welcome to attend. It's the third year of it. So we're going to set up a committee like that across the organisation with internal and external support about how we can have a strategic plan for systemic change at the Roundhouse, but not only internally. So we've done all the retrofitting of LED lights and all that kind of stuff, and all the new buildings we have made have been of excellent level and environmental standards, but also how our artistic public-facing programs can give information. But more importantly, I think the thing that we want to do is to make the Roundhouse a platform for people to talk about it. So it's again listening and having formal structures for listening. Because if there is that terror of where your next meal's coming from, you can't talk about some of these really important things, which we may feel are really important, but actually if you're wondering where your next meal coming from, they aren't important at all. So I think there's a real diversity of challenge within that as well.
Well, we've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I think this is sort of the panel that could launch 10 other panels. But I want to take a question that came in from one of our guests in the audience and sort of wrap it into my last question. It's sort of a closing out question, and we will, I want Marcus and then Stephanie and then Diane to answer this question. So we have set up a tremendous brief and scope for cultural institutions in this conversation, right? Not only will we be addressing these vast problems, but we will be changing while we're doing this. This is really a very tall order. All of this, obviously, as everyone here and in the audience knows, involves resources, finances. So my closing question to you is, do you believe that the field is capable of meeting these challenges? And if so, what are some new financial models that could allow the field to actually attempt to address all the issues and adaptations we've been discussing? And let's start with Marcus.
Thanks for that.
I know it's really easy, you can do it in a minute.
New financial models. Well, I think we, in the Roundhouse, we kind of live in one anyway. We have less than 8% of our budget is government public money, and 92% of it we make or is fundraised. So at the beginning of the COVID, we lost 70% of our budget in one go, 50% redundancies over a short amount of time. So do I believe we're going to have to adapt to new ways of working if we're going to achieve these goals? We have to be very clear about what our goals are. And usually when people have great ideas, then money follows. Governments are slowly changing. And if we can, as a sector or an industry or whatever word you want to use, show that we are together, and I'll take Diane's point on that, collectively together, and we can champion what we want to achieve, then I suspect that money will follow on from there. But I think it does mean that we can't work alone on this. And, I think there was a thing in the chat about UN framework. Again, using the frameworks that are available to us to make sure that we are facing in the same direction at the same time. And we reflect on that old definition of insanity, doing the same thing in the same way and expecting a different result. Now, we have to do things differently. We're still at the early stages of doing that differently, I think. I'm a real positive and optimist. I don't think optimism in this day and age has worked very well because, we'll be open by Christmas. No, we're not. We'll be open by spring. No, we're not. Let's just be positive.
Stephanie, working in a very different context of the United States, do you see the field being able to make these changes, and where can you unlock new financial solutions? Are you working on new financial approaches to facilitate all of this?
Yeah, so I want to say, first of all, yes, I believe that the sector can do this, but and recognize that we are in the early days. In terms of the public funding models, I think that alongside conversations about racial injustices, there are conversations about redistributing wealth within communities and within government budgets. So we are working with some artist facilitators who are looking at the public safety budget for the city, for example, and thinking about, the community shifts, what the community wants to see, and the shifts in the way that resources are allocated. And they're looking right now at public health programs. So I think, what we're hearing today, again, these are all sort of the threads of it about mental health and well-being, but that's where they're starting. But I imagine that there will be conversations to come where we're also thinking about cultural community organizing and how that will have a place with some redistributed resources. I think also in terms of local, and maybe this is too much of a US context, but local benefit or local option taxes like the hotel tax that have just taken such a massive and disruptive hit. We're going to be forced to come up with some new business models. And yes, that's about collaboration and alignment of resources. But I do think that we are just beginning to innovate where those shortfalls will be made up.
And in the museum sphere, there's been a vibrant discussion about sources, tapping into sources of new money, including the big debate on the accessioning and others. As you look out at the future, do you see optimism check from you, and what new financial approaches do you see? That could help the field respond to these challenges?
Well, I want to quote Yuli Decker. I mentioned the Anchorage Museum in Alaska before. She said that it takes bravery to change systems. And just wanted to give you one example of what she has done. She decided to turn one room, which was dedicated to temporary exhibitions, so huge money-making room, into an empty space, given being able to empty space offered to local communities. And this was really brave, really difficult, but she's now finding funding to fund and to support this space, because it is actually giving a voice and to local communities. And she's starting to measure impact beyond output. She's just starting to change practices, changing behaviors, and she's naturally, step by step, changing the behavior of funders and the behavior of sponsors and different kind of supportive institutions. So it's like by changing your own behavior, it is difficult. You can change the behavior of the others. We have seen in the climate and museum scene lately, a foundation actually funding, so museum can spend budget into their waste and energy audits. So step by step, we start to see new practices appearing, but we need to first ask for it and just not ask for the old good things.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I think this conversation gave a taste of the very difficult two-front war that cultural leaders are fighting. On the one hand, to hang on to what they've got, to maintain these incredible institutions and this rich cultural life that they are contributing to sustain all that. On the other hand, to work and be an agent of change. It's very difficult to do both of these things at the same time. But if there's one conclusion that we reached, it's that collaboration, systemic engagement, reaching outside of the sector, collective actions and policies are the path. And that underscores the importance of organizations like this one. And I want to I just want to thank all of you for participating, Adrian for convening us, and the Cultural Districts Group in general. And I wish you the best of luck. I hope the next time we talk, we will be looking back in the rear mirror and busily building these new changed institutions that we've been imagining today. So thank you again very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening or midday or morning or whenever you're listening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. It was